I'd like to welcome everybody to this TAPS educational presentation where we have industry experts that are going to tell the truth about the crisis in the cattle industry today, about the meat you purchase, and about the deception by our government and corporate giants and how we make changes. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the TAPS group. We came together in 2021 as grassroots producers and also consumers, and we decided the only way to save our industry was through new legislation, and that would bring back profitability to our industry. I'm going to read to you the mission statement of the TAPS group. It's to restore the livelihood of the cow-calf producers and a competitive marketplace through legislation, therefore stopping the hollowing out and decimation of rural America. Also to provide the beef consumers, our customers, the ability to choose American-born, raised, and harvested beef through legislation mandating truthful labeling of country of origin of all meat in America. Also to provide resources necessary to educate cow-calf producers and beef consumers about the crisis we face in the cattle industry and the importance of convincing elected officials to pass the AMP Act to return to a fair and just cattle industry. The AMP Act was drafted in 14 months by beef producers and consumers and industry experts. Then the legislation in December was reviewed and edited by experts, including law professors in the agriculture field. As we introduce this new game-changing legislation, it's vitally important that producers and consumers are aware of its contents and the importance that it becomes law. Everyone's encouraged to spread the word as we're fighting corporate giants who manipulate the markets, including prices and availability. They are deceiving America's public each and every day. Today, we have experts who are going to describe what's happening in the industry, and we're going to start with Bill Bullard. Bill?
Yes, welcome everyone, and thank you. So Josh, I'll need that now. Thank you for joining us today, and we're going to try to put up some slides, and what we're going to do is talk about what is required for a competitive market to work. And of course, you've got consumers on one end of the supply chain, you've got producers on the other. And then we're going to talk about the conditions of the US cattle industry, as Chuck just described, that's in a state of crisis. What are the long-term projections? What impact will that have on consumers and producers both? And then what needs to be done about it is what Chuck just said, and that's the AMP Act. It's significant, meaningful, we might even call them radical reforms are necessary now to address the severity of this crisis. So we're going to start with what it takes, how a competitive market should work in the food system. Now, the beef industry, specifically the cattle industry, people like Chuck and others on the line who are cow-calf producers, who actually raise and sell live cattle. And it's the largest segment of American agriculture, which means it's vitally important to rural communities all across America. It is the economic cornerstone for much of rural America, being the largest segment of American agriculture. And it generates about, just the live cattle portion, not the beef portion, generates about $66, $67 billion a year. So it's a multi-segmented supply chain with the cow-calf producers at the base. And we have about 750,000 of them scattered all across America. Again, the economic cornerstones for rural America. And so in a competitive marketplace that has a multi-segmented supply chain as we do, and I'll describe that. That would be people like Chuck who keeps the mother cows, raises a calf every year, raises the calf for 4 to 8 months, sells the calf downstream in the supply chain. It's purchased by another segment that grows the calf for another 4 to 6 months. And then it goes into the feedlot sector of the industry. And that's the final segment of the live cattle supply chain. After it leaves the feed line, it's delivered to a meat packer, and the meat packer converts the live animal into consumable beef. And then the meat packer in turn sells it further downstream to the distributor and then to the retailer. So this is very much a multi-segmented supply chain, multi-segmented both in the live cattle sector, cow-calf producer, backgrounder, feedlot, as well as in the beef side of the supply chain, beef packer, distributor, and retailer. So in a competitive marketplace, it is ultimately the consumer that determines the revenues that will be generated for the entire supply chain. And the consumer determines this by their purchasing choices. So when consumers buy beef at their grocery store, that beef represents revenues for the entire multi-segmented supply chain. And so a competitive market is what we rely on to properly allocate to each segment in the supply chain the competitive contribution that they've made to that final beef product purchased by the consumer. So we can measure the level of competition we have in our industry by virtue of looking at what share of the revenues generated or that are begun because of a consumer purchase, what share goes back to each of the segments in the supply chain. And we're going to make it simple. We're going to look at the beef supply chain, the packer, the distributor, and the retailer. And we're going to look at the live cattle supply chain, people like Chuck and the other 750,000 people who raise cattle, and the backgrounders and the feedlots. So just two segments, cattle side, beef side. So if we go back a little over a generation, about 40 years ago, back to 1980, what we saw in our industry is that for every dollar that a consumer spent on beef at their grocery store, 63 cents of that dollar, or 63%, flowed back to the live cattle sector of this multi-segmented beef supply chain. So it went to people like Chuck. It went to the people downstream that he sold his calf to. It went to the people who are feeding the animal and ultimately selling it to the packers. So that's the live cattle segment. So 40 years ago, the live cattle segment received 63 cents of every dollar, and the beef segment, the packer, the retailer, distributor, shared in 37 cents of every dollar. So now we jump forward to today. So that was the competitive marketplace. It was allocating profits to each segment of the supply chain based on their competitive contribution to the industry. And of course, we rely on the invisible hand of competition to do that. There's no formula, there's no rule. It's just how a competitive market works when it has robust competition. So now we move forward to today, and my data is based on 2021, so a year ago. And what we see is a complete reversal. In 2021, 63 cents that used to go to the live cattle supply chain now goes to the beef supply chain. 63 cents goes to the packer, the distributor, and the retailer. And only 37 cents goes back to be shared amongst these 750,000 cattle producers in the industry. So you have a complete reversal in a time span of about 4 decades. And you have to ask the question, if it were competitive in 1980 and the lion's share of every consumer beef dollar went to the live cattle producer, and if that's when we had competition, what would cause a complete reversal of that? What would cause those allocated revenues that used to go to cattle producers are now being deflected and going to the beef packers and the retailers? How can that happen in a competitive market? And the answer is it can't happen in a competitive market. That's not how a competitive market works. So we know fundamentally from the very beginning that the marketplace is fundamentally broken. Something happened. And now we tie the consumer into this. And the consumer is very, very important because that's the reason we have 750,000 cattle producers left in the United States. It's to serve the protein needs of consumers. And the beef industry is the #1 protein. From our perspective, of course, I don't know that I can prove that, but we believe that to be the case. But it's clearly the largest segment of American agriculture. So I'm showing you a chart that just goes 12 years, 2010 to 2022. And this is monthly data. And the blue graph represents the price of beef that consumers pay for and are willing to pay for in their grocery store. The red line represents the value of the fed cattle, the animal, that is raised by the live cattle segment. So we can see that from 2010 to 2014, there was a harmonious and synchronous relationship between the price of cattle that the cattle producer received and the price that consumers were paying for beef in the grocery store. Now, this makes sense because there's really only one ingredient in beef, and that's cattle. And so, and if we go back in earlier years, we see that this has been the case for decades, that there has been a close synchronous relationship between the value of beef and the value of cattle. And then something happened in 2014, and prices both that consumers paid and producers received were largely the result of widespread drought that we had in the United States from 2011 to 2013. Our supply numbers shrank, but demand for beef continued to grow. Consumers' willingness to pay more for beef continued to accelerate. And then we hit about 2015, 8 years ago. Something happened. 2015, we saw cattle prices inexplicably collapse. They collapsed further and faster than they ever, any time in history. They collapsed for almost 2 years. And after the cattle prices started to collapse, we saw an anomaly. We saw the blue graph here. You can see that monthly prices that consumers were paying for beef continued to increase, to skyrocket for about 8 months after the cattle prices collapsed. And then the consumer beef prices began to follow the cattle prices downward until about 2017. And in 2017, we had a rally in the cattle industry, and there was increased prices for beef at the grocery store. But you can see now the spread between the two is wider than any time during the period depicted in this graph. But in 2017, we saw retail beef prices just march skyward. They were clearly hitting record high prices that consumers were paying for beef. Now, this was before the inflationary period. And at the same time, we saw cattle prices stair-stepping downward. The downward trend is obvious, and they would try to recover, but they could never recover to the point that they were in the previous rally. And so they stair-step downward. So we had an inverse relationship. We had retail prices that consumers were paying were going skyward. We had cattle prices stair-stepping downward. And then we hit another severe shock to the marketplace itself, and that was the drought of last year, beginning in 2021. And supplies again began to tighten historically. And as a result, we saw cattle prices start to rally again. But then, even then, we saw consumer beef prices just off the charts, continuing. And then we had the combination of inflation that exacerbated this situation. But what you can clearly see in this chart is that consumers are being exploited because they're paying super inflated prices for beef through this period, beginning in 2015. And the cattle producer is being exploited because their prices have been seriously depressed. And never in history have we seen a spread as wide as we see today between the value of beef that consumers pay and what the cattle producers receive. So let's look at this $67 billion live cattle industry, of which Chuck and others are a part of. And we look at it in terms of the factory. In order to produce the beef, you need to have a factory. And in this industry, the factory is the mother cow, the cow that bears a calf every year that's raised ultimately for harvest. So we go back, this chart actually starts in 1975, where we had high numbers of cows, beef cows, mother cows in our US cattle herd, over 45 million of them. But since that time, as this chart depicts, we see a long-term, over 4 decades, of a downward trajectory, a contraction in the number of cattle in our beef cattle herd. And then in the middle of this chart, you see I denoted where the North American Free Trade Agreement was implemented. And the significance of that back in 1994 is that was the only solution that Congress would offer the cattle industry and the consumer to maintain that synchronous relationship between retail prices and beef prices. They said, what we need to do, and the only thing we need to do, is expand foreign access to US beef, expand the available market opportunities for the US cattle industry. And by doing so, they said, we would increase demand for beef, and that increased demand would lead to higher prices, and the higher prices would lead to prosperity for U.S. cattle producers, cow-calf producers, backgrounders, and the feeders. But as this chart depicts, after the North American Free Trade Agreement was implemented, we continue to see a downward, sharply downward trajectory. And in 2014, you can see in recent years where we hit a low. We had the smallest cattle herd in the United States of America that we've had for over 7 decades. So the industry has shrunk alarmingly. And then we tried to recover, and only to hit another severe shock to the industry, a drought. But very importantly, you cannot attribute drought as the long-term cause of the decline in the number of cattle in our beef cattle herd, the mother cow herd, which is the industry's factory. You can see that there must have been other factors, because throughout history, for over four decades, we've been shrinking the mother cow herd. And the solution, the only solution offered, and that was the free trade agreement to expand export markets, was an abject failure. It did not reverse the contraction of the cattle industry. And of course, the number of cattle in the herd represent the competitive infrastructure for the entire industry. And now we go to, well, the number of participants. And this chart goes back 4 decades, and you can see that we began with about 1.3 million cattle producers all across America. And since 1980, the number of cattle producers that have exited the industry is absolutely alarming. We've lost over 4 out of every 10 cattle producers that were in business just a little over a generation ago are gone today. And now we're down to just about 750,000 cattle producers. Now, this data ends in 2017 because the U.S. Department of Agriculture decided they would no longer publish annual data regarding the number of cattle producers. Now we have to rely on the census that only occurs every 5 years. So we have a huge gap between 2012 and 2017. Latest data available was 2018, and we've had no data since then. But we know that the combination of increased inflationary production costs and the ongoing lack of profitability because of those low prices we've experienced for the 8 years after 2015, we know we've seen these cattle producers dropping like flies. So we do not know where we are in 2022 in terms of cattle producers, but we know it to be low. And so again, here is another element of our competitive infrastructure. You have to have the factory, you have to have the participants in the industry, and we're seeing those participants decline in numbers at an alarming rate. And then we have the marketplace available to all of these producers like Chuck and the backgrounder to get to the final segment of the live cattle supply chain. And that's the feedlot. That's where they feed the animal for about 120 days. And it begins when it's about 12 to 15 months of age. It's brought into a feedlot for 120 days, fed a high concentration diet in order to fatten the animal up. And that's why you have such tasteful beef in America. So this chart goes back 25 years. It goes back to about the time that we entered the North American Free Trade Agreement. We started with about 113,000 of these feedlots. Again, that's the marketing. That's the marketing segment. That's the marketing outlet for all the cattle producers. And we've lost now over the course of 25 years, despite the fact that we entered the North American Free Trade Agreement and a host of other free trade agreements, like with Central America, like with Australia, for example, we have free trade agreements. But notwithstanding that, we saw our marketing outlets available to Chuck and other cattle producers exit the industry. We've lost 75% of all of our marketing outlets in the past 25 years. We've actually lost 85,000, approximately 85,000 feedlots. And now these feedlots that were feeding that animal for the last 120 days of their life cycle, the ones that have dropped like flies are the family-sized operations, the ones that had relatively small feedlots. They had less than a 1,000 head capacity per year, and they were contributing to their rural communities, the economic viability of those rural communities. And so here's what we see in the industry, that for 4 decades, we've seen a rapid decline in the competitive infrastructure of the industry. We see our factories disappearing. We see our number of participants are disappearing. And we see the marketing outlets available to them are disappearing. And what I'm not going to depict here in a slide, but so today we have 4 multinational, transnational, whatever you'd like to call them, global beef packers that control 85% of the entire fed cattle market in the United States. We have an unprecedented level of concentration in the industry. So we know that our competitive infrastructure is disappearing. We know that this has been happening for decades. We can predict the future if no significant, and I said radical earlier, if no radical reforms are implemented in order to stop the ongoing contraction of this industry. And as it contracts, we see that consumers are paying super inflated prices for beef and cattle producers are exiting the industry and dropping like flies. And now we look at, well, what about the economic viability of the industry? What about people like Chuck? And the U.S. Department of Agriculture maintains annual data as to the returns that people like Chuck get for each of those mother cows in the factory. And this is a return per bred cow. And this chart goes back again to about the time of the North American Free Trade Agreement. And we can see that over 25 years, it has been a downward trajectory for the returns that people like Chuck and other cow-calf producers receive from the industry. Of course, this coincides with the lack of competition that has caused the consumer beef dollar to flow mostly back to the retailer and the packer and not to the producer. And this data reflects that. It illustrates that, in fact, the cow-calf producer has been facing a lack of profitability and downward revenue stream throughout the last 25 years. And then we look at the last segment of the fed cattle supply chain, and that's the cattle feedlot, where those animals are fed for 120 days. And we see here again, a downward, the dotted line is the trend line. And of course, the horizontal line is zero returns for feeding a fed animal. So this data is monthly data based on over 22 years of returns to cattle feeding in the United States. And what we see is that the cattle feeder is for a long time not recovering their cost of production from the marketplace. And so we have an industry that for 22 years has earned on average on a monthly basis negative $27 per head per month for 22 years. And so this explains why we've lost 75% of those feedlots, but it doesn't explain why we have any feedlots left in America. And of course, this is the result of a lack of competition, a purging of competition from the industry, with these 4 huge meat packers controlling 85% of this market. And so what we see here is evidence that competition has been purged, evidence that the live cattle sector is not receiving their competitive share of the consumer beef dollar. And that means someone other than the cow-calf producer is receiving profits, and it's the consumer generating those profits because they're now paying super inflated prices for beef. And then we go back to a chart depicting those 2 pie graphs. So back in 1980, where 63 cents of every dollar went to the live cattle producer, you can see that this has been a downward trajectory over a long period of time. One exception, when we had the huge severe shock to the system, the drought between 2011 and 13 drove the share that the consumers, the share that went back to the cattle producer as a result of the consumer purchases, drove it up, but only temporarily, and it immediately collapsed again and continues to collapse. And now is the cattle producer share that was once 63 cents of every dollar is now historically low at 37 cents for every consumer dollar. And then we have to look at globalization, the impact in addition to the purging of competition from the industry. And that's a result of concentration, high levels of concentration. We also have to look at globalization because, again, globalization was the only solution offered to the cattle industry for 4 decades, and best represented by our entry into the North American Free Trade Agreement. So what I'm showing you here is from 1990 to 2021. So this is a past couple decades. And the blue graph represents the annual imports of beef and cattle that are entering the United States. And the maroon or brown represents the volume of beef and cattle that are exported around the world. We import from about 20 different countries. We import beef from countries like Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Uruguay, Honduras, Brazil, Australia, New Zealand, Mexico, Canada, Namibia, Africa. We import beef from 20 different countries. So as you can see, we import far more than we export. And this is specific to the Canada and Mexico that are involved in the North American Free Trade Agreement, now called the US-Canada-America Agreement. And so what we can see is under this free trade agreement, the US cattle industry is burdened by annual deficits of about 2 billion pounds of beef. We are actually, on average, over this entire period, we are purchasing more beef from abroad than we sell abroad by the tune of $2 billion, or excuse me, 2 billion pounds of beef every year. Obviously, this deficit that we experience with the North American Free Trade Agreement pulls our industry down. They're substituting this imported beef for domestic beef, meaning that if there is a demand for beef, the meat packers can choose to buy beef from any 20 of these different countries and have no impact on the US cattle industry, other than to drive their prices down because of the lack of demand for US cattle, because the meat packers have other choices. And so this is the Canada, Mexico, United States trade patterns over the past 22 decades. And now I'm showing you the world patterns. So we know that we suffer a huge annual deficit in our trade agreement with Canada and Mexico. But if we look at the entire world, we see the same thing. We see that every single year we have a deficit. We purchase more than we sell abroad to 57 different countries that we export to, for example, but we import from 20. And so you can see that the solution offered to the industry is an abject failure, because we continue to burden our industry with undifferentiated imports. And so what we know about our industry is we are in the decline, a rapid decline, an unprecedented decline, and this is a severe crisis. And so what do? Well, this was caused from a lack of competition. It was caused because we've allowed, and I say we, I mean our US regulators, did not enforce our antitrust laws, did not enforce the Packers and Stockyards Act and other antitrust and fair competition acts. And as a result, they were able to take over the industry and deflect the profits that should be going to the cattle producers. They deflect them back to themselves, the packers and the retailers. And so we have the concentration problem. And then, as we've just demonstrated, we have a globalization problem, because we entered globalization under the pretext that we would build export markets, increase beef demand, create prosperity for cattle producers, and importantly, we would provide consumers with more choices. That didn't happen. Consumers go to the grocery store and they don't have a choice between beef from Australia, Mexico, Canada, the United States, because they're not informed as to where the beef came from. And so chief among the very first thing in the AMP Act is what's called the restoration of mandatory country of origin labeling for beef. And what this will do is it will inform the consumer as to precisely where the beef they're purchasing from their family originated, where that animal, now remember, it takes a long time to bring a calf that Chuck raises to the marketplace, 15 to 18 months, for example. So country of origin labeling will tell the consumer where the animal was born, whose cattle industry benefited from their purchase, tells them where it was born, tells them where it was raised, which cattle industry around the world benefits from the consumer purchase in terms of adding value to the calf through the feeding process. And then it tells you where it was harvested. And that tells you, well, was it slaughtered in the United States of America, or was it slaughtered on foreign soil and imported to the United States? So mandatory country of origin labeling informs consumers with accurate information as to where the animal had been born, raised, and slaughtered. And when a consumer purchases a product that is exclusively born, raised, and harvested in the United States, then they know several things. Number one, they know they're supporting America's national food security, because they're supporting America's supply chain for food in in this case, beef. The other thing that they know is that the United States maintains the most stringent health and safety standards in the world. And so consumers that purchase the exclusive USA product knows that its entire life has been spent in a food safety regime that is surpassed by no one. And so just those two factors, health and safety and supporting America's supply chain and our national security, are choices that consumers can only make if they have access to the information as to the origin of the animal. So the AMP Act does that. It empowers consumers to choose from which country they want their beef. And in those choices, they can determine whether to support American cattle producers like Chuck and others, or support foreign companies that are raising cattle on foreign soil and accessing the US market through free trade agreements primarily. And so, but then it also, the AMP Act also addresses this purging of competition from throughout the system, from the marketplace itself. And the way it addresses this is what we found through concentration is the meat packers have developed instruments that they use in order to obtain cattle without having to compete for them in the marketplace. And we have in our marketplace something called the Fed Cattle Cash Market. And it's where the packers make offers to cattle producers, and cattle producers review the offers and accept or decline them. And ultimately, that's price discovery. That's where you find out what the competitive value of an animal is. Well, our cash market during this entire period has been shrinking at an alarming rate. And now we're somewhere around 20%. Only 20% of the cattle are sold in the competitive marketplace, while approximately 80% of the cattle are sold through these novel instruments that are used to avoid competition in the marketplace. The AMP Act addresses that in a number of ways. Number one, it will force those four largest packers that control 85% of the fed cattle market to actually compete with each other for the available cattle in the cash market. And the way they do that is to force the packers to compete by telling them you have to purchase at least half of the cattle in that competitive marketplace. And then it addresses these instruments that the packers have introduced in order to purge competition. And chief among those is what's called a forward formula contract. And it's a contract that removes cattle from this competitive marketplace so that it do not contribute to the price discovery at all. And yet, when those cattle are ultimately delivered to the packer, the price of those cattle is tied right back to that ultra thin cash market that today is far too thin to establish a competitive value for cattle. And then the AMP Act goes even further, and it addresses the fact, well, we have four packers controlling 85% of the market. We need more packers. And so the AMP Act addresses how do we incentivize local and state and regional meat packers to begin creating more market outlets for all these 750,000 cattle producers if we have that many left today. And it goes even further than that. It addresses the fact that our national security interests are severely jeopardized when our food processing system is in the control of foreign entities. Of the four packers that control 85% of the marketplace, two of them are Brazilian owned. In the pork industry, for example, the single largest pork producer in the United States is now from communist China. It's Smithfield Farms has been sold to a Chinese company that has very close ties with the Chinese government. So we have been on the wrong path for over 4 decades. As a result, we have threatened the national food security interests of America. As a result, consumers are paying superinflated prices for beef that are no longer connected to the value of the cattle from which the beef was produced. And this brings us to the serious crisis. And then again, on top of that, we have inflation. We have cattle producers who need to buy feed or see exponentially increased prices for the feed. They're seeing exponential increased prices for the fuel, and we're in a state of crisis. So there's the background. That's why the AMP Act is needed. That's how and short description of what the AMP Act does to address this with respect to the foreign ownership of U.S. processing plants. The AMP Act would prohibit that, ensure that our food processing system is in the hands of and in the control American companies, which it is not now. And so with that, Chuck, I will end. And if there's any questions at the end, would be happy to answer.
Bill, thank you. It's very important information, and it's something that everybody that's involved with beef should know. And for more information, everybody should look for the TAPS group on Facebook or email us at tapsgroup@gmail.com. I believe we've got Mike Schultz. Mike, do you have something to add, please, sir?
Mike, you're on mute. Mike, you're on mute. There you go.
Better? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Chuck and Angie. To kind of give a little self-explanation, I do chair the COOL committee for RCAF, work with Bill quite a bit. I want to address a couple things. We've been meeting recently with some congressional people on the issues of the Farm Bill coming up, and we're kind of pushing for the AMP Act to try to get that out. So I want to address a couple things today. One is the effects of MCOOL, the things that I think are really important in the AMP Act. Or the first section is MCOOL, the Packers and Stockyards is section 2. The OFF Act addresses the beef checkoff, and 5 is the competition deal, of which Bill has talked a lot about today. For those of you that are not aware, I've got a slide presentation I'll give Angie and be willing to share it with everybody. It goes over some documents you may want to follow through with. One's a US ITC trade case that was filed against the imports of Canada and Mexico back in '98. Since that time, we've had the appeal ruling from the WTO. We have addressed that WTO concern quite well with the MCOOL bills we're trying to pass right now and part of the AMP Act to reduce record-keeping burden for imported livestock. It provides importers the opportunity to improve accuracy of labels. It expands the scope of beef muscle cuts covered by COOL requirements, eliminate unnecessary exemptions, broaden the definition of a retailer, and empowers the food service establishments to provide origin of information on beef. So I want to bring that up because the WTO will be the first thing you'll hear from your congressional people. When you bring up the supporting AMP Act and the issues in the American Beef Labeling Act, they'll bring up, well, there's a ruling against you on the WTO. Right now, and I just did the research this week, the WTO is in disarray. There has not been an appellate panel adopted yet. The people have not been picked because the U.S. has abstained from selecting those people. And there was a report out that said that the WTO basically was either a success or a failure. The bigger percentage believe it was a failure, even for the poorest countries. So we're at an opportune time. We've talked to Bill about this too. If they were to argue against the American Beef Labeling Act as MCOOL, they would have to refile another case to carry that on. And by mentioning that, the trade case was $1 billion trade threat. And what they said during that trade case was that the Canada and Mexico could impose a retaliatory tariffs of 1.1 billion for Canadians and 227.8 million for the Mexican market, respectively, as of December 7th, 2015. I want to go through this because I shared this with Chuck. We have lost about $1,000 a head on our calves since December 22nd, 2014. Every year since 2014, when implementation of COOL was fully implemented, we've lost about, on an average, of about $1,000 a head. And for those of you that don't know, we slaughter roughly about 34 million head of cattle a year. So take that times $1,000. That's definitely $34 billion. And if you take that times 9 years, I think, Chuck, and my memory isn't always great, but I think it's around $306 billion we've given up of money that comes back to our rural communities. So we need to address that. We've got claims back in around 97. We had around 134 million head of cattle. We've claimed today around 92 million. We've got 34 million mother cows. And that's the decline that Bill talked about. And I'll tell you this, Brazil, our biggest problem coming down the road right now is they collectively have about 232 million head of cattle. They expand their herd in a projection by 24 million head of mother cows by 2030. And their market is for export market sales. So those of you that understand why two of the meat packers are now purchased that were owned by a Brazilian government, basically, that's where the meat's coming. It's going to come to the best market in the world here in the US. Further, I would mention a note. We work with a guy that's one of the largest beef procurement buyers in the Midwest. He now works for a huge retail place. They have around 3,200 stores. Just recently, they imported beef that was brought in a box, non-labeled, and a grocer here in the United States asked if he could put an MCool label on it as USA product on an imported beef deal. So when you hear that and people say, well, that doesn't happen, that's a lie. It does happen. And this guy testified to that. So those are a few things I guess I want to bring up. I believe the Packers and Stockyards Act, the ban of packer ownership, feeding, or control for more than 7 days that we've gotten the AMP Act is a very good deal that we need to get passed. And there's no reason for the Packers to own the cattle like they do. And I remind people with the Packers owning cattle, and they say, well, they don't do that really. Well, there was a case called Easter Day that happened in Washington State to the tune of around $2 million with Tyson. They had bought cattle, put their brand on them, Easter Day did, and they were paid by Tyson. So as an independent cattle person myself, and if as a buyer of cattle, if you go to the auction and you're competing against a guy with an open checkbook, you're going to lose. And they had a sweetheart deal set up with Tyson to buy cattle and basically drain everybody else out of the industry in that area. So remember those things. In closing, I've got a chart here. I'll share it with Angie, and you guys are more than welcome to take it and go from it. But Bill's chart, when it showed about the cattle market, the decline for the cattle producers and the retail beef price spread, I want to share with a little information I did the last time we were on here. In 2012, the United States generated a little over $66 billion of revenue sales in cattle. In 2013, it was $67 billion. 2014, when MCool was implemented, we generated a little over $81 billion. Now, if you remember that chart he showed you, the peak in 2014, the beginning of 15, was an all-time record high prices for cattle, and the beef price was in correlation with that. Then the disconnect happened, and the Packers realized they didn't need us. They paid less for the cattle, and they started importing again. And now in 2021, they reported we were at $65 billion in sales. So my point is that money is gone out of rural America. That's money that I use to buy equipment, buy tires, pay my taxes, property. And so as I tell the legislators, that's money that your constituents have lost. And it went to someplace else besides the United States. Most of it went to Brazil. So those are a few things I would like to share. I think the OFF Act, we've got to get control of the beef checkoff. That's in our AMP Act. Go through that. That's a good piece of legislation. Hopefully we can get this all done, and we need everybody's help to get it done. Chuck, I'll close there. If there are questions, I'll share this one presentation with Angie, and she can share it if somebody wants a copy of it.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, it's very important that people realize what's going on in rural America. Mike had just mentioned that. If you take a road trip across Texas, like I do from time to time, or wherever you may live, and get off the interstate, go drive through the rural areas, the small towns with maybe a couple of caution lights, maybe a long strip of buildings there that are kind of boarded up. Maybe they've got a convenience store. And you ask yourself, why is this happening? Well, it's because the farmers are gone. When the farmers have money, they spend it. When they're not there to spend the money, the place dries up. So that's what's happening right now in rural America, and we want to change it. And the only way we think that's going to get changed is to pass the AMP Act. And to give you a little history on what we've done, we've talked to the offices of 5 senators and 4 congressmen and 2 ag commissioners. Nearly everyone we talk to, when we talk to their point ag person, the first thing they tell us is, hey, we know what's going on in your industry because we listen to the cattle associations. We listen to NCBA. We listen to Southwestern and Texas Cattle Raisers Association. We go to their banquets. Their lobbyists talk to us. Essentially, they're getting wined and dined by these people. Maybe they contribute to their campaign funds. Who knows? But they don't have the real information. They need to go out and talk to the people that put their boots on and go out and pull the calves and feed the orphan babies when the mama has mastitis. They need to get out on the ranch and talk to the real folks in the trenches doing the work. And what we have to do and what we aim to do in TAPS and everybody who joins us is to educate everybody as to what's going on in the cattle industry. And we need to demand that our elected officials work for us and listen to what we have to say. And I want to ask Joshua to talk a little bit about these cattle associations. Joshua?
Yeah, can everybody hear me just fine?
Great.
Okay, hopefully there's not too much background noise here. So yeah, the cattle associations that we've all heard of, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, and their state affiliates, whether that be the Oklahoma Cattlemen's Association or the Texas Southwestern Cattle Raisers, the Texas Cattle Feeders Association. These cattle organizations are all tied to the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. Well, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association is a combination of the meat packers and the cattlemen coming together to form the NCBA. And the biggest thing is with them and why we seem to be fighting them all the time, especially whenever we try to make meaningful industry reforms like 5014 or mandatory country of origin labeling. The reason that we seem to be butting heads with them all the time is because they represent both cattlemen and meat packers. Well, the meat packers are going to have the biggest wallet, and everything is going to be dues based. You serve the people that pay the dues the most. And whenever you have those packers and the packers are against those industry reforms and they sit upon the board of these organizations, that's whenever you have, in my opinion, a conflict of interest. It's almost like an association that represents car manufacturers, but they also represent the consumer for vehicles. Well, they're not going to have both parties' interests. It's hard to have both parties' interests in mind, best interest, whenever you represent both sides of that coin. And it's hard to serve 2 masters at once. But they also are all tied to the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. And that's where we end up having organizations also that don't have our best interest in mind. And that's where a big piece of everything comes in, that's sustainability. And so they're pushing for different sustainability programs. And if anybody has ever heard of Dr. Jason Clay, I would recommend that everybody goes and finds his videos on YouTube. He did a TED Talk, but he's with the World Wildlife Fund. And I'm going to pull up. Okay, I cannot share my screen right now, but I was going to pull up anyway. He shares about how we need to create bottlenecks in order to push sustainability. And one of those ways is to create a bottleneck in the cattle processing. And so we've got 4 packers that control over 80% of the industry, and that creates a bottleneck. Well, in order to be able to sell to those processors, we're going to have some requirements, and we've seen the mandatory RFID. And that's going to be something that, well, you got to do this in order to be able to sell your cattle. And so the whole end goal of everything is to end up pushing a sustainability piece. It's going to be picking winners and losers in the industry. And part of our reforms are to help fight that, to break up the monopoly of the packers. And so we're going to see a lot of pushback from those cattle organizations that don't necessarily have our best interest in mind. Hopefully that covers everything you wanted, Chuck.
Thank you, Josh. You made a good point there when you said that you're talking about the cattle industries and the packers and so forth. That's the main reason we need everybody to get behind us, because we're fighting an uphill battle. When you're fighting the packers and all the money that they have and the lobbyists, and they're all talking to our elected officials, and here we are, a little old TAPS group out here, a volunteer group that and I don't know anybody in this group that has a big checkbook that they can contribute. So we've got to have the entire country behind us. We need the AMP Act to be actually a kitchen table conversation when we introduce it. We have to have lots of folks calling their congressmen and senators and saying, hey, you know, we want you to do what's right. We want to return a livelihood to the cow-calf producer, and we want the consumer to be protected and to be able to have the ability to know that they're choosing American-born, raised, and harvested beef. That's very important. Can anyone address what's going on with the checkoff industry, the checkoff dollars, and what's happening with that?
Very, very briefly, Chuck. So the checkoff program is a program that it's mandatory. It requires every cattle producer that sells cattle to contribute $1 for every head sold into a federal fund that is controlled and influenced by these large corporations. Generates about $80 million a year. It's supposed to be used to promote beef for the benefit of U.S. cattle producers, but it doesn't. It promotes only a generic product. So it's actually helping to promote and market the U.S. cattle producers' competitors' products, all that beef coming from those 20 different countries. And it's essentially shifting the profits from the U.S. cattle producer to the major corporations. It benefits the corporations at the expense of U.S. cattle producers, and it deceives consumers, because it does not distinguish beef based on which regime it was produced under. So that needs reforms, and as Mike indicated earlier, there are reforms within the AMP Act for that program that is working against the financial interests of America's cattle farmers and ranchers.
Bill, could you talk about the importation of the beef tongue that was brought in and then sold as export beef under the USA label?
Yeah, so what Mike's talking about is the arguments for exports is that the industry claims that we have to have exports because there's some products that the United States doesn't eat from a cow here. And of course, one of those products is tongues. We consume very few tongues, but countries like Asian countries find that to be a delicacy, and so it receives a premium product. So the United States, of course, exports many tongues to countries like Japan and South Korea. But what they don't tell you is we import a lot of tongues from countries, more than just one country, Canada primarily, but we import tongues from Canada, and then we turn around and re-export that product to those same Japan, South Korea, other Asian countries, and we put a product of USA label on the box. And so the reason we do that is because the packers know that the US beef is coveted the world over. And if they can buy the product cheap from Canada and then turn around and sell it as if it were produced under the good name and reputation of the U.S. cattle farmer and rancher, and they can profit from it. That's exactly what's going on.
Tell us-
Matt,
tell us-
Matt, and along those lines, doing some homework on some of that for the Kansas Cattlemen's, we were looking at country of origin labeling requirements from other countries. And Australia, this seems to be a very true argument to make with Australia, because Australia won't accept imports from Canada. But if it has product of the US as its label, they will accept that import from the United States. So thus, all that meat that is imported into the United States and packaged and whatnot, processed and put the product US label on it, Australia will then take it, but Canada can't ship directly to Australia.
So let me add just a qualifier to that, and that is that each of the countries that we export from establish their own standards, criteria that must be met in order for us to export. Some countries, as you indicated, do ban beef from Canada as a result of the BSE or mad cow disease problem that they had back in the 2000s. Other countries say that the meat must be legally imported from various countries, say for New Zealand or Mexico or even Canada. But importantly, each country establishes their own criteria. Some of that criteria will limit the origin of the beef product that can be shipped out of the United States to those countries. So you'd have to look at them country by country to determine what their criteria is. Chuck, I apologize. I need to jump off on another call with the congressional office. So thank you very much, everyone. It was a pleasure. And Chuck, happy to do this again if your folks would like to.
Thank you very much, Bill. We appreciate it. Mike, do you have any other comments?
Yeah, I just may close with one thing. Everybody's going to have to address the issue of export sales. That always comes up. They talk about export sales. You know, we live on exports, blah, blah, blah. And I remind everybody, you show me one producer that has ever received a check for 1 cent from a multinational corporation for a pound of beef or a bushel of grain that was exported. And I've done meetings for 30 years, and I have never yet had anybody show me the money that they've supposedly got through export sales. Once you sell your product and they ship it abroad, they don't come back and say, well, Mike, we sold 34 of your steers to China or wherever, and here's your premium check. It does not happen. And the same thing in the grain industry. So remember, when we're talking going forward, the WTO, the export trade business, we don't benefit from that as individual producers. So I just wanted to throw that in, Chuck.
Good, thank you. Does anybody else have any comments? We welcome any comments you have.
Hey, Chuck, this is Angie.
Yes.
I just wanted to expand on that checkoff dollar, which I know a lot of people may not know what that is if they're not producing cattle and think, well, that has nothing to do with this. But my take on it is, if we use that money to put real beef in our school systems, I mean, that would be an excellent place to put that money instead of going to promote fake meat or whatever it's, I don't know what it's doing really. I've tried to research it, and you really can't follow the money. So if you look at it from that perspective on how it does affect you or your children, and right now I know in Missouri, local farmers are giving beef so that we can have real beef in our schools. And really the checkoff dollars could be used for that. Thank you.
Angie, I might add, Chuck, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
On that checkoff money that Angie's talking about, and I try to remind people of that. When they talk about checkoff dollars, In 1995, I wrote a letter to the Kansas Beef Council asking them to take our beef checkoff money in Kansas and start purchasing a packing plant. And they said there was no way one plant would make any difference. So let me remind you all this. We collect about $82 million a year. Do you think that that would have an impact and we could have possibly bought more than one packing plant by now? $82 million a year, excuse me, 82 million a year. We would have owned several if we had invested our own money where we should have. But I dealt with that here in Kansas. I fight the Kansas Livestock Association. That's why I founded where Matt Steele works at the Kansas Cattlemen's Association, is I was tired of that. I mean, we've fought this deal for 30 years, and we've got to get the congressional people behind us, and you have to demand some changes. We can't keep going the way we've been going down the same road. It's not going to happen.
Brett Kinsey, are you on?
I'm on, Chuck, but my service is barely. Can you hear me?
Yeah, give us some comments, Brett.
Well, I guess I jumped on late. I don't know the audience. I'm a little bit unprepared here, and we're getting ready to haul hay because we've got the fourth blizzard and a little over a month coming down on us.
Oh man.
But I guess I just wanted to jump on. I thought Josh Knope did a great job explaining the GRSB and this global elite movement that's coming in. He just maybe misspoke, and I'm saying that in a friendly way, on one thing. Jason Clay, the founder of WWF, who's tied in with this GRSB and URSB that wants to ram global governance down our throats, he didn't necessarily say that they created it, but it sounded a little bit like it when he spoke to the bottleneck of the major processors, the big four. I mean, it's telling to me that an outside influencer like GRSB could come in, look at the weakest point, which is also the strongest point of our food system here in America, which is that choke point of the four major processors. So, for over 20 years, RCAF has been fighting for competitive markets, a checkoff that works, product differentiation to help us compete in a free market. And it's evolved into this choke point that now we have another front of the battle expanding, which is this global elite war on beef, war on fuel, war on everything really that makes our lives what we hold dear. So I just think that we have to realize, I think often, my dad's been gone since 2012, 11 years. Imagine if he were to come back and look at this country today with fresh eyes, with where it's gone in the last 11 years. And so that really is what we're fighting against, guys. We've been fighting a rough battle for 20, but now it's growing into a bigger one. So I think really what we're doing here, what this AMP Act does very well, is it addresses maybe American food security in terms of protein production. It's the American cattleman is making America's last stand in terms of independent production, food security, entrepreneurship, independent production, work ethic. Those are the things that we're fighting for, not radical new ideas, radical old ideas. So, no, I thank you guys for your time. I got to listen into the end of Bill and Mike's comments and Josh's and everybody else's, and I appreciate these meetings. Thank you.
Thank you, Brett. The point you made that RCAP has been doing this for over 20 years, and I thank Bill for mentioning in one of our prior meetings over a year ago that he thought it was necessary for an omnibus bill because that's kind of what we thought when we had our first meeting with Ted Cruz's office. They told us that they would be happy to get behind any bill that we saw that we liked that was before Congress, and we told them at that time that, no, that's been happening for 20 plus years. And it's like Einstein's theory, doing the same thing over and over again is the definition of insanity. And not to say anybody's insane for trying, but we decided that the only way to make this happen is to write a complete bill, get it introduced in Congress, get co-sponsors, and get the general public behind us. So that's what we've done. And we just have to continue to bring awareness to the cow-calf producer and the general public. I might just say too that it would be good for everybody, as you're talking to people about this, just ask them, do you know what's going on in the beef industry? I found that I talk to people that are down here, we call them day workers. They go out and help people work their herds, and I'll see them in the feed store, the tire shop. They have their 28-foot gooseneck trailer on with their horses and their dogs, and I just ask them what they think about MCOOL, and they don't even know what MCOOL is. And these are cattle producers that work cattle every day. So people have to be aware of what's going on. The general public has to be aware of the manipulation by the packers. They manipulate the supply, they manipulate the price. And if people don't know that, we're lost from the beginning. So we have to make people aware, and we have to get people to get behind what we're doing. And again, we thank everybody for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to Angie. She's going to tell you a little bit about how to get in touch with us, and hopefully we can get people to back what we're doing and help bring our movement to fruition. Angie?
Can I make a point?
Thanks,
This is
Jeff.
Kathleen.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I know Bill did a really good job. I understood more every day. I understand more and more. Like I said, I'm kind of new to this. I consider myself more of a hobby farmer, and Mike makes some really good points too. One thing though that I do see, I say not as a problem, but for people like me, and I know a little bit, but just a little bit, but there are so many people out there that don't know. And these meetings that we have, when we do these graphs and charts that address people that are in the know, it would be nice if maybe I would do it, but I don't know how to do it. Maybe get some kind of presentation to address how this affects the consumer as far as their prices. Because there's a lot of women out there, especially on Twitter, that are city people, and they would love to know this stuff, but to see a graph and a lot of the things that you guys are saying, it would go right over their head. Because honestly, even though I know some stuff, a lot of the stuff does go over my head. I mean, I feel like a dummy sometimes listening to some of the things that you guys say. They're great, but I can grasp a little bit of it. But there are a lot of parents out there that this is just prices, this is money for them. When I used to have a LinkedIn account and I would talk to these, I call them suits, these men, these lawyers, these doctors, they don't have a clue where their beef comes from because they just get it fed to them. They don't know. So if maybe there's some kind of way to make a small presentation that I could put on Twitter and I could share to regular people as to how this affects them. Does that make sense at all? A
Yeah.
little bit?
That's very good. Thank you for that, Kathleen. And we'll make a point to doing another presentation that addresses that. Let's get together and discuss the points that need to be made, and we'll certainly do that.
Okay, I appreciate listening. Thank you.
Okay, Angie?
Yes, thanks everyone. Thank everybody for being on, our speakers and those listening. And just remind you that you can find us on Facebook at TAPS Group, and then there's 19 states who have their own TAPS Group. And what you do is just put the state name in and TAPS behind it, and you should find it. If you find that there's not one in your state and you're passionate about what you've heard today, get a hold of us and we'll set you up and you can admin a site for us. As Kathleen has said, we have a Twitter account. I think that's TAPS Group too. I'm not even sure. Kathleen, you might jump in there. And you can find Chuck Gabbert or myself, Angie Mormon, on Facebook on our personal pages if you want to contact us there. I think that covers it all, Chuck.
Yeah, Kathleen, do you have that Twitter information? Kathleen, are you there?
I'm sorry, I'm still learning my computer. I'm trying to unmute myself. Yes, it's just if you go to Twitter and it's at Texas Taps. As far as the official, how to find it, you can just look up TAPS, so TAPPS, and you'll find it, or at Texas Taps, but it's on Twitter. I just looked, it's already got over 300 members, which is pretty good considering it's very new. So it's growing.
Very good. Does anybody else have any comments or questions?
This is Angel in Kansas. May I jump in?
Sure.
So I would like to address a little bit of the consumer conversations. When I walk up to a group of hunters or fishermen, I ask them, how many trips out into the woods would it take for you to fill up your freezer with meat for 365 days a year? Not just on occasion, but for 365 days in a year. How many trips would you have to go out into the pasture to gather up berries to feed your family for 365 days a year? You need these cattle producers. I do not raise cattle. I am just a consumer. One of the things that sits back in my mind is a history lesson over in England, in Ireland in particular, where the potato starved out an awful lot of people, but sadly it was not the only crop that failed. It was the only crop that the Irish depended on. Imagine having just buried your children at the local graveyard and you're walking by these fields of grain that are just swaying in the wind and being harvested and hauled off to other countries. That's the direction that the United States is headed into. And unless we stop it and take action, what you put on your dinner plate is going to be drastically affected. That's what I tell people when I go to a crowd and I run into those city folks. I agree we need to work on that an awful lot harder. And let me know if there's anything that I can do to help. I see the back end of this. I see what happens after the farmer goes bankrupt. And I see how this land then falls into prey for preservation and recreation schemes. So there's a big trickle down effect that occurs when you take out an entire industry. Thank you.
That's very important, Angel. Thank you very much. And we'll certainly ask you to be on our next presentation where we do talk about how the consumers are affected. Anybody else with questions or comments?
Chuck, this is Jim from Indiana.
Yes, sir.
I'm a small, very small cattle producer, but I'm also a businessman. And one of the concerns that I really have is that of giving this industry, this line of our food to a foreign country. I mean, that has never worked for the United States. We always lose every single time. I'm in the garbage business as well. And a few years ago, just for instance, a few years ago, the president of China, 40% of our recyclables used to be bought by China. One day, the president of China woke up and decided he was going to cut that stream off. And when he cut that stream off, that meant 40% of our recyclables had nowhere to go. And so we went from making $35 a ton to losing $65 a ton to deal with the recycling products. I see the same thing happening with this beef industry. We've watched our manufacturing jobs go to China because we couldn't compete with the people making $1 an hour to make an inferior product and flood America with inferior product. Now I see inferior beef flooding the market, making it impossible for our people to compete. And Congress is sitting by and doing nothing. And I love the comments about consumers, because I'll tell you what, I know these 4 big meat packers have a lot of money. they can sit there and they can take and wine and dine and do whatever they need to do to lobby Congress to make sure they're taken care of. But I still have enough faith in our nation and our flag that the real power of our government is the people. And I think we need some moms. We need 100 moms and 100 families marching with signs out in front of a grocery store that says, "Where's my beef coming from?" We need to get people's attention, because that's what Congress is going to pay attention to. We can talk to our congressmen and they can sit there, and I've done it too many times. I was a mayor for 12 years. I've done it too many times where a congressman sat there and said, oh yeah, yeah, and then turn around and nothing happened. But when the people get their attention, they got their attention, because that's the power. And so I really believe that it's in our best interest to start thinking of how do we get on Fox News? How do we get on Chicago media? Because I love the comment, the consumer, this has got to make people angry when they go to the supermarket and they think that their beef is coming from a ranch in Texas or Montana or Wyoming, and it could be coming from Africa or Brazil or Argentina. That's got to make people angry. You don't have to be a beef producer to get mad about this thing. And I think we've got to really work on getting attention.
That's very important. I've said that all along from the very beginning, that what we're doing is in vain if we don't have the consumer behind us. And I've yet to figure out how we do that, other than, like you said, get the attention of Fox News, get the attention of MSNBC, of all the networks, get interviews, do interviews in magazines, periodicals, newspapers. That's very important. I feel like that if we become vertically integrated and there's only the large beef producers out there supplying the packers, that the American consumer is going to be relegated to only being able to choose unlabeled foreign imported beef, while our choice beef is shipped overseas to the highest bidders. And that's what we're here for, and that's why we wrote the AMP Act, and we've just got to get everybody behind us.
The graph that Bill showed, where it showed a discrepancy in how much the consumers' prices have increased, and the producers are making so little. If he could just do that graph and do a more shorter narration of how that affects the consumers, the moms, and then also add on to that around 2015 when Cool was repealed, and how it has made it worse and just made it a little bit shorter, I could share that with a lot more people on Twitter. And those are the people, plus now everybody's all mad about this China thing. And to show everybody how foreign influence is affecting us at home, Americans at home, consumers at home, I think that's what's going to get people fired up.
Agreed.
One of the things that I've been doing is looking at, like, the Kansas City Star or the Denver Post is putting ads in the paper that shows pictures of land mass owned by the federal government, and it has one line that says, when does food production become important? What I'm finding is that the average person who votes and who pays attention to politics don't usually spend all that much time on social media. All it takes is one person to see that ad, and then they take it to the local coffee table and it becomes a discussion. So a quick, like that graph with the one, I like the slogan, "Where does your beef come from?" would make an excellent ad. And for a few hundred, I think the most I've paid for an ad was actually the Kansas City paper, and that was I think $600.
You'd think we could use the beef checkoff money to do that.
Good idea.
Okay.
You talk to the checkoff people, talk to NCBA, see if they'll do that.
This is Carol with United Animal Industries. I know I show up as Bravo 3, but that's what we show up for operations and emergency management meetings. I have been in the background watching, learning, listening, participating. I think that Jim has a good point there, as well as Angie and Kathleen, that what we see as we network with multiple different organizations and groups is that one hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing. And there are a lot of different organizations that are all working towards our freedoms, but we don't know what the other one is doing. And being able to gap the bridge of communication, the language barrier, the understanding one person's area of expertise or their lane, it needs to kind of cross over into other people's lanes with respect to their area of expertise. And so what we're finding is that we have in our legislative groups, we have those people that do work for us who are willing to work for us, but they just don't know. And so what we're finding as we work a little bit with some teams who do work with some of the staffers, that there are many receptive representatives that may or may not co-sponsor or sponsor the AMP Act, but they need to actually see it to confirm. Of course, they're not going to commit to anything until they see it. We have had an opportunity with some other issues we've been dealing with to plug this AMP Act to several, and also participated in, as a fly on the wall, the meeting with the ag commissioners, and have been kind of burning their ears privately in private messages prior to that, encouraging them to take a look at this and to support it. And I think what's happening is that bridge, that gap between the different organizations has to be, there needs to be a network where each one knows what the other is doing, and mostly for operational security, because a lot of you guys, all of us that are ranchers and farmers, our noses to the grindstone. We're not on social media a lot, and we're not in the loop. So Angel's suggestions about going local, talking to your people local when you go to your feed store, being knowledgeable about the challenges, and how can we make that apply to those individuals in their lane, their area of expertise. One of the things that made us learn this was our efforts with the convoy. The convoy was where we learned how badly we're being censored and suppressed to fight for our own freedoms. When YouTube is striking your channel for saying Constitution or freedom, things like that, it makes it difficult to network. And our opponent has done an amazing job of censoring and not allowing us to communicate on these platforms with one another. And so these Zoom meetings are very helpful with that, knowing that they likely are watching what we're doing. But the opponent has all of these hungry people out there. And what they're doing is they're taking money, say $100, $200, and they're saying, here, go sabotage that farm. These are these animal rights activists, and they're sabotaging these farms. They're stealing gates, they're stealing fences, they're sabotaging animals, and they're taking out the very bloodlines that are the healthy bloodlines of our industries. So when we are talking to these different groups, making sure that they understand, if you speak out, you are sticking your neck out there, you may be under attack, that everybody needs to keep their head on a swivel and watch out for one another and communicate with one another more than your cows are out. When things are happening, don't be afraid to say, hey, did they steal your gates too? Because my gates got stolen yesterday. Or did they shoot your bull? Because my bull got shot. For us to communicate those things and be on the offense, know that this is about to happen to those of us that are fighting for this is as important as being able to bridge the gap of our consumers and helping them understand why this is so important. So I think that based on the teams that I've been networking with, if we have the actual document that we can send to them, I think that we can get several sponsors and co-sponsors on board. And I also see that we have teams that are standing by waiting for content to be able to share and network out. And these people are really good on Facebook. They can make Facebook and the new applications or social media platforms like Locals and True Social, where we can actually network out and campaign out some of this information that is understandable for those that are not cow-calf producers like we are. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Carol. Anybody else have any comments? Well, thank you, everybody, for being here. Again, we're TAPS Group on Facebook, or you can contact us at tapsgroup@gmail.com. And we'll be on with another presentation soon, hopefully more geared toward the consumers. Thank you all for being here.
Thank
Thank
you,
you,
Chuck.
everyone, for all your hard work on everything.
Thank you.